Hello, my name is Elizabeth Beckman, and I'm a Clinical Knowledge Management Analyst at the University of Kentucky Healthcare. Today, it's my pleasure to share with you some of the exciting things we have been working on in the UK Clinical Knowledge Management Program. Today, I'll be providing you with the 3,000-foot overview of clinical knowledge management, and then zooming in on the clinical knowledge products that we have developed in combination with the Markey Cancer Center. I would like to disclose that I do have a relationship with a drug reference database, although it is unlikely to conflict with the content of this presentation. By the end of this presentation, I hope to relay the importance of clinical knowledge management and how to overcome some of the challenges of delivering evidence-based care. Additionally, I will provide some ideas of how you can incorporate these UK clinical knowledge products in your daily practice. Lastly, as we move through this presentation, I ask you to reflect on ways that your practice can be enhanced or how current practice gaps may be closed with the use of these clinical practice guidelines. It is no secret that we all have a shared objective. We strive to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. So how are you maintaining this objective in the current environment of increasing demand to be more efficient with your time and your resources, the intensifying pressure to provide more value-based care, and the current explosion of precision medicine testing and treatment in oncology? As you might be experiencing in your own practice, providing all these rights is challenging, and I do not anticipate that these challenges disappear anytime soon. One of the issues being faced by oncology practitioners is the sheer volume of information that is being released. And let me tell you, it is quite impressive. So according to the Precision Oncology Knowledge Base, or OncoKB, there are 477 cancer-associated genes identified to date in 60 different tumor types. Of those 477 genes, there are over 3,800 unique genetic variations. And with 86 targeted drug therapies on the U.S. market, knowing how and knowing when to connect the drug to the genetic alteration is not as obvious as it seems, especially with this varying level of evidence that is being generated. Aside from the vast expansion in evidence, the pace at which this evidence is generated puts an additional strain on the practitioner. To put this in context, I recently performed a PubMed search to see how many results I would get in a 3-month time block for the search terms cancer and immunotherapy. From the beginning of 2018, in a 90-day window, this search returned over 1,800 hits, which equates to about 20 publications per day. Without a date filter, there's nearly 80,000 publications queried on this search phrase alone. So let that sink in, how much volume of information is being generated. So how is one person, one practitioner, to have the time to sort through all this evidence and maintain a full patient load, plus all your other professional and personal responsibilities? So at this moment, you might be experiencing a wide range of emotions thinking about this volume and pace of new information. I suspect you might be feeling anxiety, frustration, exhaustion, or possibly even defeated. Know that you're not alone and that we are here to help. The University of Kentucky Clinical Knowledge Management Program is here to provide you with an arsenal of clinical knowledge products to make your practice more efficient and more informed by putting the need-to-know knowledge on demand within your reach. So what is this clinical knowledge management that I keep talking about? So clinical knowledge management is the expression of the standards of care through creation of evidence-based clinical practice guidelines. It takes us back to our primary objective as practitioners to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. The clinical knowledge products will provide the right guidance to the right provider, making the delivery of the best care inescapably easy. Clinical knowledge management aims to bring evidence-based guidelines to fruition that ultimately will lead to the delivery of evidence-based care and hopefully better care to the patient. Better care delivery can then lead to better health for that patient, and delivery of better care can lead to better health that will ultimately lower costs to the individual patient. When you apply that to the population as a whole, cost savings may be extrapolated to the healthcare system and perhaps even as far as the Commonwealth. Clinical knowledge management can add value to all of these components through providing accountability for the evidence-based practice, adding efficiency to delivery of healthcare through reduction in practice variation, and practice standardization. Now we're going to start taking a deeper dive into the clinical knowledge management process. The process unfolds first with an inquiry into the clinical question, followed by the attainment and assessment of that evidence, and synthesis of that evidence into a usable and reliable product or tool that then can be shared or applied to the customers, with the consumers being the patients, you and I as the providers, and even insurers. However, moving a knowledge product to the consumer is not a simple or immediate process. There is a known evidence to practice gap that is often referred to as the knowledge translation gap. There are a number of barriers that contribute to the knowledge translation gap. As I have previously illustrated, the rate of new evidence generation is occurring at an alarming rate, along with medically complex information that requires expertise in a variety of specialty areas. There is also a cost in creating, maintaining, and implementing new evidence, and the infrastructure developed to support these best practices. Additionally, another challenge is how to package this medically complex information in a way to successfully discuss the benefits and risks with the patient. Lastly, insurance coverage in this rapid-paced environment will often lag behind and create another barrier to providing the best care and most current care to these patients. The Clinical Knowledge Management Program has 3 solutions to help bridge this knowledge translation gap. First, clinical practice guidelines serve an important role to assimilate all relevant and applicable evidence into one document. These guidelines are created through a process that includes engagement of key stakeholders and subject matter experts, a rigorous review of the evidence, which culminates in the consensus-based recommendation for best practices in a given area. Next, creating an active process to communicate results to a particular audience is imperative to closing the knowledge translation gap. Strategies for dissemination include synchronous dissemination through presentations such as this, and asynchronous dissemination through venues like the World Wide Web, such as the Markey Cancer Center affiliate website. Implementation is application of knowledge to improve the health of patients. Implementation of guidelines is in an electronic format that can be widely distributed, readily accessible, and easily updated and incorporated into daily workflow is the desirable vehicle for bridging the knowledge translation gap. So what is this relationship between clinical practice guidelines and the practice of precision medicine in the cancer population? Clinical practice guidelines are instruments that help us inform and instruct on the best practices at the population level, whereas precision medicine is a discipline that informs care at the individual level through personalized or customized medicine. So how can clinical practice guidelines that are appropriate for the group or a majority be applied to personalized medicine? How can we bridge that gap between the best practices for a disease population and the best care for the individual? We believe that answer to this question is the utilization of the clinical practice guidelines coupled with the expertise provided by the UK Markey Cancer Center Molecular Tumor Board. The guidelines to be presented today are the products of collaboration with the Markey Cancer Center Molecular Tumor Board and the Clinical Knowledge Management Program. The Molecular Tumor Board is engaged throughout the entire guideline process. These guidelines are meant to inform the treatment decisions made by the Tumor Board. Conversely, the Molecular Tumor Board is tasked with providing timely updates to reflect current literature and practice trends. With this close working relationship, we anticipate rapid turnaround of subsequent revisions, thus keeping these guidelines current and relevant. Zooming in on the process, all guidelines released by the UK Clinical Knowledge Management Program follow this process map for development and maintenance. It is a 6-step process that guides the development of clinical knowledge products through the identification of a specific topic, assimilation of the expert project team and creation of the document, followed by the document endorsement or approval, then move through the dissemination and implementation phases. Once that is complete, the active guideline will be evaluated for the practice impact for the duration of its life cycle. The impact assessment will inform the curation process and the need for further amendments based on internal data, as well as the inclusion of newly published evidence. I would like to take the time to talk and elaborate more on the second piece of the development process, so that you may have a better perspective of the construction of these documents. The Guideline project team included a variety of disciplines across the healthcare spectrum. Disease state experts, drug experts, and laboratory pathology experts weighed in on the content of these guidelines, whereas the stakeholders helped shape the scope, the look, and the feel of the document to ensure that the guidelines would be usable as well as valuable. Evidence was collected from a variety of sources. The National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, provided guidelines for treatment of cancer by site. These guidelines were used as foundational knowledge since they contained many of the specific recommendations that were being sought. OncoKB and CBioPortal are precision oncology databases that were used to query supporting clinical and biological evidence. Lastly, PubMed was utilized to support our endeavor to provide the most current published data applicable to our guidelines. All of the evidence was compiled and critiqued by the project team based upon the agreed-upon rubric for the level of evidence grading and the grading for the strength of recommendations. The final products of our efforts over the past 6 months are 2 clinical practice guidelines encompassing recommendations for molecular tumor genetic testing and molecular targeted drug therapies. Here is the moment you've all been waiting for, the unveiling of these clinical practice guidelines that I have alluded to since the beginning of this presentation. Provided on this slide is a visual of the table of contents of both guidelines developed and endorsed by the UK Molecular Tumor Board. Please note that all guidelines published by the UK Clinical Knowledge Management Program will follow the same format featuring 7 sections, first being the scope, followed by methodology, which is the evidence and recommendation grading rubric, an introduction, recommendations, which will be the substantial portion of the document, references for recommendations, a UK implementation plan, and lastly, a disclaimer for use. So as promised, we are now going to take a closer look at these documents, starting with the Molecular Tumor Genetic Testing Guideline for solid tumors. Each recommendation was evaluated for the level of evidence and strength of recommendation. The level of evidence grading took into account the type and rigor of evidence that was being utilized to formulate the recommendation. The NCCN rubric shown here at the top satisfies both the level of evidence and the strength of recommendation needs and was used as an independent scale. It features a grading scale from Category 1, which is the most robust level of evidence and the strongest recommendation, through Category 3, which is the lowest level of evidence and the weakest recommendation. Please recognize that many of the NCCN recommendations are categorized as a 2A, which signifies a lower level of evidence but a uniform NCCN consensus. In the absence of an NCCN recommendation, the level of evidence was graded on the Oxford Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, shown here on the left, which assigns a level 1 as the highest level of evidence, that being a meta-analysis, and level 5 as the weakest level of evidence, meaning there are no studies and it's only mechanistically plausible. The strength of recommendations was assessed by the SORT rating scale, or the strength of recommendation taxonomy, shown here on the right, which assigns a level A, B, or C grade based on the quality of evidence. For the recommendations in this tumor genetic testing document, 5 major recommendations were included, encompassing the test type to order, when to do the test, and the specific test recommendations based on the tumor type. The test recommendations for solid tumor type included the 7 types of cancer listed here. Each tumor-specific section will be formatted in a similar fashion as the screenshot on the right. Each tumor type will have paragraphs of text with supporting evidence referenced and the associated level of evidence and strength of recommendation as shown here in the parentheses, where you can see both the NCCN evidence grading here at the top and then the Oxford and the SORT at the bottom. Furthermore, the information in the text is summarized in a table below that identifies the genetic mutations as discussed. Since we have now concluded our quick overview of the molecular testing guideline, we are going to take a closer look at the UK Molecular Targeted Therapies Clinical Practice Guideline, which aims to match the molecular targets with available drug therapies. We used a similar strategy to the testing guideline for the evidence and recommendation grading in this treatment document. Again, the NCCN rubric satisfied the needs and was used as a unilateral tool. Unique to this particular guideline is the development of the colorful grading scale to be used in combination with the NCCN recommendations. If any of you have submitted a patient to the Molecular Tumor Board for review in 2018, you have likely received the Tumor Board recommendations featuring this grading rubric. For this rubric, the presence of the drug therapy's FDA indication and the type and rigor of evidence supporting the indication was utilized to select the recommendation level as indicated in the color assignment. The green recommendation is of the highest level, featuring an FDA-labeled indication for the drug, coupled with the highest level of supporting evidence, that being a meta-analysis, randomized controlled trial, or an OncoKB rating of level 1. Everything below the green indicates the drug therapy is not FDA labeled for the indication and thus considered off-label. Since supportive evidence exists for off-label drug use, the level of evidence will dictate the final recommendation. Yellow is off-label therapy that has support from at least phase 2 studies and above, or an OncoKB level 2 or above, which is considered standard of care by that database. Pink is off-label therapy that has support from phase 1 studies, case reports, or case studies, or an OncoKB level of 3, which is considered supporting clinical evidence. This color assignment suggests that the drug and the molecular target should be explored through a clinical trial, if one is active and if the patient should qualify. White is the biologically plausible off-label therapy, although there is little to no human data to support routine use. And lastly, the red, as offensive as it is on this slide, translates into do not use. This therapy has been demonstrated in phase 2 studies or above to have no benefit and perhaps even cause harm. The major recommendations featured in the targeted therapy document include the expectations for the Molecular Tumor Board with maintaining and updating the document and the conditions to meet for off-label therapy. The majority of this document is dedicated to drug therapy recommendations for the 9 solid tumor types as listed. Here is what the recommendation table looks like in this document and how the color assignment for strength of recommendations is utilized. The top row features the potential tumor genetic alterations found in a particular tumor type. The left-hand column is the list of targeted drug therapies in alphabetical order to be used in this tumor type. The boxes will correspond with the drug and genetic target, and each colored box with a small superscript letter in the corner corresponds with a footnote underneath the table, which is not shown here, in order to reflect the rationale for the color assignment. So let me show you an example of how to use this table. So let's take a patient with a gastrointestinal stromal tumor whose genetic mutation panel resulted with a positive tyrosine protein kinase, or a KIT, gene mutation. Upon examining the KIT column, you go down the column to find your first colored box with a superscript. Upon finding this box, you follow this row over to the corresponding drug therapy and find dasatinib. Because of the pink color, you can infer that the dasatinib is an off-label choice of low, moderate quality evidence. Additionally, the pink color should trigger you to explore clinical trial options. To find out more why dasatinib is graded this way, the box refers you to footnote D. In footnote D, you can read about the drug mechanism of action, the frequency of the genetic alteration, and the drug's effect on the genetic alteration with information on tumor response rates, progression-free survival, and overall survival if available. The recommendation made by the NCCN panel is featured in the closing statement of this footnote, and in this particular example expresses that dasatinib is an alternative therapy if other therapies have failed. So where can you find these guidelines that I have discussed today? Well, they are featured on the Molecular Tumor Board webpage on the Markey Cancer Center website. Molecular tumor board is a subpage which can be found under the Research tab on the main Markey Cancer Center page. These clinical practice guidelines will be posted under Guidance Documents, which is found on the right-hand bar. When you click on the Guidance Documents hyperlink, you'll be routed to this part of the web page. The most up-to-date documents will be featured on this page, so I encourage you to bookmark and use this website as your source of truth, rather than printing or saving these documents. These clinical practice guidelines may change rapidly. They are quite lengthy, so please save some trees by referring to this web page. Now you might be wondering of how you can use these clinical practice guidelines in your day-to-day practice. So these documents can serve as a great educational tool for trainees, as the recommendations are evidence-based and referenced and all in one spot. Additionally, they may serve as a reference for you in your own clinical decision-making process. These guidelines, although not constructed for patients due to their complexity, may be able to provide a framework for shared decision-making in a select group of patients. Another important use for these documents is using them to inform and defend your recommendations to add a drug to formulary or to request a specific laboratory test. Also, creating clinical decision support tools in the electronic medical record can really increase the traffic and thus the utility of these documents in your practice if you choose to implement them in this fashion. And lastly, the documents may be used to help persuade a payer source to cover services or therapies, as the evidence and recommendations are nicely presented all in one venue. So by now, I hope that I have offered some clarity in the processes of clinical knowledge management and have suitably escorted you through the development and design of the current precision medicine clinical practice guidelines. However, keep in mind there are parts of the clinical knowledge translation gap that we have yet to overcome. First, can we keep pace? There is so much information being captured and released. How will we ever be able to stay completely current? Our process for review of these guidelines is not automated and very much relies on the recognition at the practitioner level to suggest a change. Secondly, the clarity around the level of evidence. As the precision medicine field explodes, the randomized controlled trials will lag to support practice since they are so time-intensive and financially burdensome, and therefore practices may be based on lower levels of evidence. We have to come together to collectively decide if this is an acceptable way to practice. And lastly, we are still working on finding the most appropriate vehicles for effective communication, both internally to our UK providers and externally to the Markey affiliates. At UK, we are assuming the best way to reach you is through the affiliate website, but perhaps that is not the best way for us to disseminate this new and changing information. We also have made the assumption that these documents will meet the needs of the community practitioners, as they currently meet the needs of an academic hospital model. However, we do realize that this may not be true. That is why we need you to use your voice. Recall what I asked you at the beginning of this presentation. Reflect on the ways that your practice can be enhanced and how current practice gaps may be closed with the use of these clinical practice guidelines. Please send along any new, missing, or incomplete information for these clinical practice guidelines with references if you have them. Please offer feedback if there are other tools or guidance documents that you want to see. Is there a better format to present this information, or is there a better venue to house this information? We want to know all of this, so please feel free to contact us through any of these emails listed below. Remember, we are all a community of precision medicine providers for the Community Commonwealth of Kentucky, and together we share the objective to provide the right care to the right patient at the right time. So thank you very much for your time and attention to this very important information.